Welcome to another historical presentation on Springfield, Missouri. Today is part 2 of the history of the square, where we'll be covering the areas from 1930 to the present. This presentation, of course, is sponsored by Richard Crabtree with Murney Realtors. I'm a historic realtor, and I can get you the whole story. What do I mean by that? Well, you're not just going to get a disclosure that a seller has filled out. I'll be able to get you when the house was built, who's lived there, who built the house, when it was maybe caught fire, when it was expanded upon, who's lived there, who's died there, so on and so forth. So you get the whole story when I help you out to try to buy or sell a house. On with our presentation. Well, the square in 1930 had just experienced a tremendous change in the sense that the stock market had crashed at the very end of our last presentation, and now we were starting to go through the changes of an early depression. But thank goodness in 1933, Prohibition was over, so beer was now flowing, and you could go to your local beeratorium and get your favorite scuttle of suds and enjoy beer once again. That kind of took the edge off, so to speak. And marketing at that time had to get very creative because, one, there was less money to be able to spend on that sort of thing. And McGregor and Fellini had reached out to the folks there at Hers and asked them if they could place one of their new cars right above the entryway so people could see it on the square. And they agreed. And you can get a better view of that entryway, that metal facade and covering that they had. It was put in place back in 1915 when Hers was built on the square, just beautifully ornate and obviously very strong. Well, in the 30s, especially 1934-35, we saw the beginning of what we call FHA. And FHA at that time allowed you only to remodel an existing home. And so Carl Bisman got together with some fellow builders in Springfield, and they acquired this run-down old house and drug it to the middle of the square and then showed them the process that you went under place to remodel a house. Now, this was an extensive remodel. You can see in picture number 3. I mean, they ripped off all the siding and then redone the roof. It's a kind of a lower pitch in number 4. By number 5 and 6, we can see that it's really coming together and looking like a typical Bisman house with a side porch. What was really interesting, and that's Carl up there, by the way, what's really interesting in picture number 7 is that they've actually set up a drawing that you could get this house through the acquisition of figuring out how many jelly beans were in there, and whoever would pick the right amount of jelly beans, well, they won the house. Well, a lucky teacher was able to get his the right number, and he won the house. And this is actually a picture of that house on the square in 1934, all decorated for Christmas. He got the house, and they moved it to the southwest part of the square, about 10 blocks. Unfortunately, the house no longer survives as they put a duplex there. Streetcars around the Pie. Well, the Pie, as I had mentioned last time, was very important because it was a place for them to stand, or in this case, it was to put a house for a while, and give the place for the streetcars to rotate and pick up the different runs that they would take. You can kind of see this better here. This is the streetcar line that was coming up College Street. So we're at the college side there with Hers, and then it would split off depending on which direction they needed to go. Shopping in the 30s downtown, well, the Five and Dimes that had came in, some had been there for a while, and Newberry's would just show up there at the very tail end of 1930. That was a place for the folks to come and buy because a lot of people couldn't necessarily afford to go to Hers or Bars, and so being able to have a few dimes or pennies to go over to Newberry's and Woolworths and Kresge's, that was a big deal, especially if you were a kid. And then, of course, besides the Mozark, you had the Springfield Electric Theater that you could go and see a movie at. Reps was right next door, and that later would end up being J.C. Penney's. Christmas on the Square was always something special. Here we see the Barts and the Paramount and Mingles, and then Feynman's all decorated in beautiful garland that's strung through the buildings and onto the square. And of course, hers always did a wonderful job of decorating the store at Christmas time. Even if you couldn't afford to buy something, you at least went in there and window shopped. And you can see here the big tree that they would put right smack in the middle of the square. And a lot of this was done because, the Depression not only was an economic scenario, but it was also a mental scenario. And this gave people the opportunity to kind of forget about some of their troubles and enjoy the holidays. As the 1940s rolled around, we went from jumping from a Depression and right smack dab into World War II. And the things that changed at the theater, well, we started to have the Fox Movie Tone news showing what was going on in the world. We started to see more war movies, and we started to see war bond rallies. And they would have many rallies, especially on the square, to raise war bonds to help fund the war effort. Well, one gentleman, he decided that he was going to do something unique to make a little extra money. He opted to walk on the square and take pictures of all the folks walking around. And then he would quickly develop them, and if he could catch them that day or the next, he would hold on to them and then try to sell them to them. And most everybody seemed to buy them. They couldn't have been terribly expensive because there seems to be quite a few, as I've had quite a few people post some of these pictures underneath showing their family members in them. On the square, we had, in the Landers building, we had Evans Cutright Drugs. And one of their locations, this was probably their largest, they even had a bargain basement. And we're lucky to have a few photographs of what that once looked like. Mr. Evans, when they first came to Springfield and set up the drugstore, they used to live over in Roundtree. And they would live right at the northeast corner of Meadowmere and Delaware. And then they'd move away and then come back again. But their chain hung around in Springfield for quite some time, even though they're based out of Oklahoma. Kresge, of course, at the time, way before Kmart, one of the things that everybody talked about on here was the ability to get hot, fresh donuts. And they had a little donut maker there in the window, so you could smell those donuts as you walked in the store, even on the sidewalk. So you can grab some to shop with, or possibly just to walk around the square, go catch a movie. 1941, we see Mr. Harry Morgan. Mr. Morgan is a photographer who lived up near Commercial Street and had his shop up there. And he was well known in Springfield, did not drive, and so he would either take a streetcar or hop a ride with somebody. And he was hired by Francis Xavier Herr to come down and photograph some of the freshening up that they have done to the store. This is a great photo that he did of the main floor, and do pay attention to the columns. They have these beautiful kind of like Moorish English plasterwork that's on them, and then the coffered ceilings that are just outstandingly beautiful. It reminds me so much of the stores when I grew up going to Sticks, Bear, and Fuller in St. Louis, or Famous and Bar. A little bit of going to Marshall Fields, though that store is quite ornate. But to most people, this was the most prettiest store that they've ever seen, especially in the southwest part of Missouri. And if you're lucky enough, you may get offered the opportunity to model some of the spring fashions in the front windows, as many people did. A lot of women would come down here, sometimes kids, and model for spring and fall. And you never know if you got to see your wife or your daughter or some neighbor up there. And they would parade through the windows, and then they'd have some music piped outside and talk at the same time. Now we're up in the photo studio at hers, and as you can see, it was a busy affair, and several women there mounting pictures, framing pictures, and having people pick out what they were going to order. And of course, behind them is where they did all the photography and development. Third floor, we find ourselves with the sports shop and new fashions. One thing of note, this was very common back in that time period. something that was held over from the beginning of the century, and that was putting fresh flowers throughout the store. Remember, there was not a lot of air conditioning for a while, and people's bathing and deodorant, that was something that would take a while for people to start doing. So having as many fresh flowers in the store was always helpful. One department that seemed to last in most all these big department stores was the book part. And so we had books and arts and needleworks. I can remember going to some of the old department stores I grew up with, and they always had a book section that I was drawn to. And that was something that I'm sure a lot of people enjoyed to go and enjoy. And then we also see they had luggage up here as well, which we see at a lot of the stores today. Of course, I don't remember this so much here at Dillard's, but I know Famous, when they were here, they had a lot of carpets and drapes that you could go see, and especially more so the carpets. And Dillard's and them always had drapes, but they had a wonderful selection on every store, and this is again why it's called a department store, because each floor is a different department. The appliances were on the mezzanine. Now, years later, this would be a spot where you would go to eat and hang out, maybe have tea or something to nibble on. But at this particular time, this is where they had all their appliances. And then here you also get to see that beautiful Moorish English plasterwork that's on the columns. Well, as World War II came winding down, they had just conquered the German army earlier in the year, and now we're in August, and the Japanese surrendered after Harry Truman ordered the bombing over there in Japan, and the boys got a little rambunctious, and they got an effigy of Tojo and somebody else, and they threw them up there, and they were going to burn them. And the boys were celebrating a lot that night. Didn't see many girls in these pictures, but mainly all guys down there. A lot of young, some back from the war, some older, and unless you lived through that time frame, you just can't understand how ecstatic these folks were that this was all over and then they could get out and enjoy life again. Maybe we'll feel that way here in a couple of weeks after this virus finally starts dissipating. Here's a few more photos of them celebrating there on the square. And the bottom one, you can actually see the old Electric Theater and Zales in the background. Well, things weren't all peachy and rosy on the square. After the war was over, unfortunately, a massive fire broke out. Beverly's in their clothing store. And thank goodness the fire department this time got there lickety-split, and they were able to put out the fire. They first started on top of the Union Bank building because obviously it was very important because there's money in there, and started spraying down on there, and then also to try to protect the Levy Wolf building. And unfortunately, the Beverly building did not survive. It took the brunt of all the fire and had to be completely torn down and remodeled. So this is a few more photos that you can see. And of course it was cold, so there was probably some icicles hanging on it come the next morning. Well, bye-bye Springfield Pie. Finally, they decided, well, we don't have streetcar. Streetcar service ended in 1937. So now we have to figure out something better. Well, as traffic in Route 66 and other things were starting to really impact downtown and the war was over, they decided this would be a good building project to put some more parking on the square. And I'm all in favor of more parking on the square. And so they showed up for their ceremonial blow and planning that, of course, the gentleman in the background, he would be with his equipment, would be tearing up the square, but at least they got this wonderful photograph. June 25th, 1947, we see that the pie is really being torn up now, and it wouldn't be too much longer later in the year that they would really have the pie laid out to where they wanted it to look. Now, if you notice, there's a lot of bricks, and when they just tore up the pie, there's a house over in Brentwood that ended up with quite a few of the bricks, and they actually built a huge fireplace and barbecue grill inside the house with it. Really cool. It's got a plaque saying these bricks came from the pie. And you can see now that they've gotten rid of the circle, or are attempting to, and creating the quadrants, the 4 quadrants that would be on the square so you could park. And in this photograph, we get to see those little posts start popping up. Now, those posts are going to be important, not for us, but for the police department, because that's going to be where they put all those lovely parking meters. In the background, we can still see what the originality of a lot of the buildings look like. The Dixie Shops, Kenny Shoes, Walk On Over Shoes, Levy Wharf. Spiegel has now taken over where the Beverly clothing store was. Union National Bank and W.T. Grant. None of these have been modernized yet. And then here we are looking with it somewhat done, and the parking meters are now in place. And this is a better view of just a tad bit later. Now, what's interesting about this one, you'll also notice next to the parking meter is one of those pillars that they used to put all over Springfield that were the street names and numbers. And I always thought that was just a horrible idea because they were so low, and you'd almost have to ask your passenger with you what the heck it says. But you better feed those meters. Boy, I got tongue-tied there. These two are going to come up and give you a ticket. And these guys didn't argue around down there on the square. There wasn't a lot of this, oh, well, no big deal. They were pretty enforceful. I hope that little outfit of this boy was saved. That would be something cute to have in the police museum. Christmas on the square, well, it was always something special, no matter what time of the year, what year it was, or the era it was. We're blessed to have this picture. It was taken by Dominic Danzero, and he got up on Union National Bank and took this panoramic, and you can just see how wonderful everything is. We know that it's about the time frame of 47 to 50 because of the quadrants and the 4 trees. Fire at the electric. Well, I don't know why, but that northeast corner of the square just has a heck of a time not trying to burn itself down. As we can see here, in December the 10th of 1947, when all hell breaks loose and the building catches on fire and multiple units start showing up trying to put this thing out. And it just burned, and you could see it for blocks and blocks, and it was just a horrible sight. And of course, the smell of all that burning. Now, what's interesting is, as I mentioned in my Part 1 presentation, when they rebuilt this theater after the 1913 fire, it said on the sign that it's absolutely fireproof. Well, what happened? I think they should go back and sue those folks for that, because obviously it was not fireproof. Here we can see the aftermath after the fire was finally put out and they come in and start inspecting. And it was just horrible because the roof and parts of the balcony had just collapsed. This is a better picture kind of showing that. It was just a horrible scene with all the debris and everything around. But you could also see it was a beautiful theater. This is probably the most interesting photograph of the bunch because in the middle there we see the fire chief and maybe the assistant fire chief walking through, and you just see the size, how small they are compared to all the rubble and then the roof and the balcony that had since fallen down. Well, if there was a heyday, or the tail end of a heyday of the square, that would be the 1950s. And Springfield was rip-rearing ready to go. Now that the war was behind us and everything looked prosperous, they started doing more expansions and more changes. This is a great photograph taken in that time frame in the early 50s, and you can see the quadrants of the square there in the middle, and up in the far right corner you can see the Springfield Gas and Electric, now at City Utilities power plant. Of course, the Grant Viaduct. And you can see not far from there, you can see the Frisco Railroad Depot and the passenger station, and then the freight depot next door. And just to the south of that would be the Missouri Pacific freight depot. The only thing standing, of course, today in that area is Missouri Pacific. Well, in 1950, Hers decided, after being built in 1915, that it was time for a major refresh of the store. So they went to the best person you could at that time, and that was William Wood Johnson of Johnson Construction. And they asked Mr. Johnson, we need to do some changes here. And one of the big changes is that we want to tear down the Baker block, which actually was almost 20 years older than the store, and change that over and make it more modern. So they started ripping down that section just to the, well, it would be to the right of the Hers building, and to build this more sleek 3-story solid looking front that they would have. And this gives you a better view of what that looked like when they were done on the square. And then they also had a new entrance on the other side. And you can start to see that the square is starting to get a lot more modernized as they have modernized the first floor, covering up the windows. And Evans has got a flashier new sign on the front. The inside of the store changed too. Now, I don't know if they removed the Moorish plasterwork or the coffered ceiling. My guess is maybe what they did is they just dropped the ceiling a little bit and covered them up and put in more fire extinguishers and new lighting. But you can definitely tell this store has a little bit more modern appearance, or modern as 1950 could be. And then, of course, they installed something a lot of folks enjoyed once they went there, and that was the Gravel Bar. A great place to hang out and grab a bite to eat. And a lot of people have told me wonderful stories about going there. This time frame, we also saw some other changes at the store. The Hers department stores now had a new owner, and then they brought in a new president because Francis finally decided to retire or sell off the store. And F.W. McClurkin had came to town, and he also lived over in Roundtree, and he was instrumental in a lot of these changes, acquiring new areas for parking and modernizing the store, trying to just get more people to come here. Now we're still a little bit away from a big mall or anything coming, but they could tell that the retail taste and shopping patterns were starting to change. And who didn't enjoy riding up and down the escalator at Hers? I mean, there was several, and a lot of people had a lot of wonderful stories that they shared about it. Of course, if you came in from the surrounding areas, this was like, wow, I'm in the big city. And I always got a kick because up in St. Louis at Famous and Bar, which is now May, they had two of their levels they had wooden escalators. And they're just really, really cool. And of course, many people at this time frame would enjoy going down the Hers, and KWTO, keep watching the Ozarks, AM 560, they would be having breakfast at Hers. And George Earl, your master of ceremonies, would lead you in a breakfast sing-along at the beginning, at the end, celebrating Hers. And they would have all sorts of fun little games and kind of a variety show that was live on the air, and you could eat and drink while this was going on. And it was a big deal, and people partook in it for quite a few years. Here's a great photo that was taken more in the mid-50s showing the gang having breakfast at Hers for the radio broadcast. Of course, Christmas at Hers was an even bigger deal. All the windows being dressed up, some animated, and just all the festivities and all the beautiful lights that would be strung around in the downtown area. And this is one of those mini window displays that you would find at Hers at the time, and just quite charming just to go down. Even if you didn't have the money, you could just still go down there and look and just be around everybody. But then again, if you did have a few dollars and Mom and Dad were feeling generous, they'd take you downstairs to Hers Toyland, which was happened to be in the bargain basement, and that's where they had all the toys. And there would be a place for you to see Santa Claus, and more importantly, what I like is ride the train. And it's interesting because this is a Frisco diesel locomotive, and it was patterned after one that they got in the 40s. So it was fairly new, and I don't know where this thing ended up, but boy, it'd be nice to have today. And of course, everybody had to get their picture taken with Santa Claus, whether they really wanted to or not. But mom and dad wanted that photo, and of course, most people cherish having those today. And here are a few of the photos folks have posted on the Facebook page and shared with me of their visits to seeing Santa at hers. Santa even made it outside and would visit the cars. And I don't know if he's handing out candy canes or just talking to people, but it's interesting. They're all lined up and headed to hers for this to see Santa Claus. It looked like it was raining that night. They were all practicing social distancing at the time. Ha ha. In 1951, we see one of the many Christmas parades. You know, there's been many, many parades on this plaza and this square, and it's amazing the amount of people that used to frequent them, and just hundreds and hundreds. Even with the parking that's there, which would have been beneficial. What's the biggest change, of course, is decorations are a little bit more toned down, but we do have 4 big trees, and they do have ribbons around the light post. Here you can see a closer view of those decorations, and you can also notice that Union National Bank is covered in scaffolding, because this is the beginning of that massive renovation of the square where everything's starting to become more modern looking, which I wish they had left alone, but at the time they thought it made sense. Over in the corner, you can see here Betty Gay. You can see Lerner's Vogue, where Coffee Ethic is. Kresge, and we have the Kresge Lofts. Down below is the library, Springfield Library today. Over in the corner, the Mozart's gone because J.J. Newberry's is expanding. And the National Shirt Shop has not changed yet, nor has Woolworths. They are still, showing their original facade. And here comes a marching band going past hers. Now you can see here in the corner, the right corner, that the hers facade, as far as what's covering the sidewalk, has changed quite a bit. For it's going to be more that modern, sleek look. And there's Santa Claus still back on the square, except this time we're looking over towards Zales and the Dixie shops, looking down St. Louis Street. Another fixture on the square for many years was Barst Fine Clothing. They were there from 1922, 1955. And the Lewis and Maurice were in there, and those two had ran the store for quite some time before they sold it off. And the that particular store, thank goodness, did not get modernized. But you can see here in 1951, there's a lot of modernization going on down there on the square. We can see that metal facade changing, as I had mentioned, on hers. And that's something that we saw closer up in the parade picture. We can also see where they have torn down the Mozart Theater, and new J.J. Newberry's is going to be expanding into that spot. $300,000 renovation. Also, this is a picture talking about the National Bank, Union National Bank being changed, and its facade, and $175,000 they spent. And Dixie shops, theirs happened the quickest, where they just smoothed the front up and removed all the ornate brickwork. Again, I wish they had left it alone, but they thought it made sense. Well, if you're going to be on the square shopping, you've got to get rid of this snow, and they didn't have the snow removal equipment that we have today, so a lot of it was just dependent upon a tractor with a little bucket going around down there trying to clean it up. Of course, it was kind of hard to do, especially with the folks parking down there. We get a good spot or shot of the old Levy Wolf. They had been remodeled after the fire, and of course Spiegel had replaced the other building. Here we have the new J.J. Newberry construction. It's also being done by the Johnson Construction Company that had just done hers. And you can see that they have ripped out the Mozart, and now they're just redoing the front and really opening up and expanding. And you see all the little skylights on top. In March 13th, 1952, Newberry's opened again to the public, and modern and sleeker than its competitors. On one side, Kresge, and the other, Woolworths. And it was huge. They had very simple pillars, very open, light, and airy. A lot of neon lights. I'm sorry, not neon, but fluorescent lights, natural light. It looked like an early Kmart, the way they had it set up. And it also sported a 88-foot food counter. This thing was huge. If I counted it correctly, I think there was about 45 chairs there. So you could accommodate a huge crowd. And I know a lot of people have mentioned on the site that they had frequented eating here and kind of missed getting sandwiches. Well, Harry Truman, he loved coming to Springfield. Of course, being native up around Kansas City, he would frequent down here more often than I think any other president that had popped into Springfield. And he flew in for a special day, June 8th, 1952. The 35th Division was having a reunion parade. Of course, he was the guest of honor. And they did a little walk with canes around the square, and chatted, ran into people that they hadn't seen since World War I. And in the bottom right corner here, we actually see him out in front of the Colonial Hotel. That's the Woodruff building in the background. And another president, or president in the future, came to town. That was Ronald Reagan, and he also brought his future wife, Nancy Davis, and they were in a movie called The Winning Team. It was based on the 1926 World Championship St. Louis Cardinals and their star pitcher Grover Cleveland Alexander, who suffered from horrible migraines. Of course, they didn't know what they were back then, so he would just drink. So in between drinking to try to get rid of his horrible headaches, then he would have the ability to get out there and pitch and win the World Series for the Cardinals. We see up there in the viewing stand Harry Truman. I love a parade. Well, don't we all? And again, we're going to see a few more parade shots because we did a lot of parades downtown. Here's something that some people questioned me not too long ago on. They saw that Walgreens sign. They said, we didn't have Walgreens. They're recent. I'm like, no, Walgreens has been in Springfield for a long time. And they were right next door to Mark's Clothing, their store. And we're standing in front of Zales here on St. Louis Street. It's fun to see all the girls in their saddle Oxfords and all the boys wearing caps, men wearing hats. This was an interdenominational parade that they had on the square. Back we can see the new Fox Theater next to Feynman's, and they're coming down St. Louis Street and turning onto the square and heading out to South Street. And that's what we see in this picture. National Shirt Shops and Woolworth, none of that has changed yet. In fact, in this particular picture, they hadn't even modernized the part of hers over there yet. It was still had its original facade and look. And then in this picture, you can actually see the facade over at hers has changed. And we have the National Shirt Shop still there. Newberry's had just opened as the new store. But the rest of the buildings are still pretty much left alone. W.T. Grant, I haven't talked much about them. They were kind of the latecomers to the square as far as Five and Dime was concerned. But they were one of the few that I remember back in the area I grew up in town that were still open. So they hung around for a while. And then, of course, a lot of people remember these wonderful striped buses that City Utilities had. As you can see on the sign, it says ride free. Well, they were trying to promote business downtown on the square and definitely up on Commercial Street. So you could ride around the square and go up to Commercial Street and shop and ride the bus for free. So if you got downtown, you had transportation between those two spots and you could enjoy it. And a lot of people did. Of course, if you parked down there, you just never knew. You may be in there working and come out and find your car covered in snow, as we didn't really have parking garages. In the background, you can see Kresge has now modernized their building. It's flat. Newberry's already been worked on, but we see the top of the Woolworth, FW Woolworth, and it's all completely been modernized. Same thing with the National Shirt Shop. So all the original facades that went back to the 1880s is pretty much gone. And this gives you a good view of what they've worked on with Union National Bank. You can see over in the far left, you can see that smooth facade with their name and the clock that they had put on there. Grant's pretty much been left alone. Betty Gay's has already been worked on. We see Lerner's, where Coffee Ethic is. And of course, we see the more modern looking Kresge, where the Springfield Library is today. So what happened? Well, suburbia happened. we started moving further away from downtown and decided that we wanted to have some shopping and stuff downtown. And by golly, that's what we got. 1948, we saw Parkin Plaza Shopping Center pop into view. Had its own ball diamond back there. Ramey's had their grocery store at the very end. And there was 3 different Parkin. There was Parkin Hardware, Parkin Variety, and Parkin Theater, which would later become the Tower Theater. Down there next to Ramey's would be Empire Bank. They had built, there was a house there on the corner for many years that the Ramey family lived in while they had their grocery store, and then it was torn down to build Empire Bank. This gives you a little bit better perspective. You can see in this slide the Sunshine Ballpark. You see the house that would eventually be torn down. You see Ramey's, and you notice all the openings. None of those businesses were built at the same time. I mean, today we're used to a strip center all being built in one fell swoop, and you rent out what you want. Well, back then you bought your little slither of land and built what you wanted. What's fun is for a lot of people that remember the Cat and the Fiddle, that's down here at the very end on the right side next to number 3. And then right behind it was a putt-putt golf place. And then we see, this is another view. We actually, in this far bottom corner, you actually see Dairy Queen. And the ball diamond is gone. Some other buildings have been built up there in its place. Putt-putt golf place is still there, though. 1951-52, we see Wedgwood Shopping Center come into being. And this was a brainchild of John Q. Hammonds. Now, as I mentioned before, Mr. Hammonds liked to do a similar style as they did at Park Inn, where they would sell off lots or sections and have the people build their own building. That way he didn't have to spend the money. So, again, each one of those buildings are unique. And he would also do that at Country Club Plaza Shopping Center as well. This is a nice overhead view of that shopping center. You can see commercial. We're on South Campbell. And then Ramey's you get later on. Of course, Machino's and Glow dry cleaning was in there. But then behind it, on Grant and Sagamot and University and Stanford, you start to see all the new housing being built. And, of course, we're just right south of Parkview High School. The one thing that really had the biggest impact downtown was when Sears decided to leave downtown and venture way, way down St. Louis Street, just blocks and blocks away from downtown, which I thought was kind of funny. But they bought all these businesses, tore them down, and then houses and businesses, and built Sears. And they just thought they were nuts. You're too far from downtown. There's people aren't going to shop. Well, they were already shopping at the little shopping centers. Why are they not going to go here? And it was a huge success. But that combination is what really started really eating away at downtown's market share. And then, of course, when Brentwood, this is an aerial view done around 1948, 47, 48, we can see that they just started building in here. And Battlefield Mall, of course, didn't exist. Mr. McFarland still had his airport on Barataria. But this was the area that was going to be developed next, especially along Glenstone and Barataria, where they end up finally, building the Brentwood Shopping Center. And then Battlefield Mall would come along later. This gives you a little bit better perspective because they haven't built the shopping center yet, but they were on the verge of doing so. And they had already bought McFarland's airport and was trying to get rid of it. The house is still there because they were starting to build Brentwood South. Gillenwater started pushing development further south into there. Well, 1960, 1970, this is really the beginning of the slide on the square. It had been going down a little bit, and they were trying to figure out what in the world to do. And you can tell that business has really started to slow down there, even though they got stuff that's somewhat modernized and so forth. You can see Sebweek's in the background behind Grant and Union Bank. But the parking down there wasn't that much parking, and so people just didn't want to, hang around down there as much because it was harder to park, and it was so much easier to pull up in front of the new strip centers. By now, Kresge has changed over to Jupiter because Kmart's were just starting to take off. And Newberry's, of course, was the most modern store down there. Woolworths did, like the Kresge building, they didn't modernize it, but the insides were pretty much the same. Hers really was the anchoring force downtown, and it was really the one thing that really kept everybody else afloat, having that massive store, still employing people and just getting people in and out. And of course, at the time, the Landers building was still an office building. But you could even tell that the parades, the amount of people showing up for parades was starting to wane. And part of this was that as Springfield and like Parkcrest, Brentwood, Southern Hills, later on early Ravenwood, they would start having their own neighborhood events and things. And so the parades downtown weren't as popular as they have been, just because everybody's so much more dispersed now. So what was the answer to the slide? And that was to build this horrendous pit. And I've talked about this often. I'm just not a fan of this pit. And I think that filling it in and providing more of the quadrant parking again would be more beneficial. You would be told that we have as much or more parking today than we did back then, and that is probably true. However, it is not there. It's further away, and people don't like to be inconvenienced and have to walk. So we'll see what happens. But then we get the wonderful bathing pool and fountain that they put in there, where the people like to hang out and cool off in. You're not supposed to do that. You're just supposed to enjoy viewing it. Then they had this massive Christmas celebration to commemorate the opening of the pit. And as you can see by the crowd, there isn't any. There's more people in the marching band than there are people witnessing the event. Again, somewhat misguided and just did not really do much of anything for down there. And it's kind of a shame to spend all that money for something that wasn't that beneficial. Even the Hearst building, by this time, they had slapped a new facade all over it and covered it in glass, and that became problems later on because glass would fall out of it when it was empty and hit people on the street. And the Christmas tree, although shiny, it just really kind of lacked the same luster that it once had. Here's a prettier picture, though, of it. And what's interesting about this is that you can see that now they have created this covered sidewalk. Again, an attempt, if you will, to lure shoppers downtown to say, hey, you can walk from building to building and not get wet, although that was only true on the corners. They just didn't blend with the building well. But it was something that they thought they would try. Thank goodness all those have been removed. Hers would have several owners, and they would try different things. And for whatever reason, the late 60s and 70s, these big, cool little signage things, logos they would come up with, again, they thought would attract people. But it really had nothing to do with the store, but looked kind of cool. So this is really the nail in the coffin, if you will, that really hurt downtown the most, and this all occurred in 1971. Now, when they first had the concept of building Battlefield Mall way, way, way far away from downtown, they thought they were absolutely mad. No one's going to go shop there. It's too far away. But shop there they did, and part of it had to do with, again, suburbia. We were building more and more homes that way. So by that time, Brentwood South, Southern Hills, we're starting in early Ravenwood. Those areas were starting to fill in, and people were going down that way, so it just kind of made sense to put it. We only had a couple of the anchors at the time because the mall evolved over time. You can see the Century 21 movie theater, Battlefield Mall, Penny's. You can see McDonald's, the one they just tore down and rebuilt at the top. You can see the grocery store where the big, tall gentleman used to stand out front holding the grocery bags, which is, of course, Hobby Lobby now. And Penny's is the one who owned the car maintenance, tires, and oil change there that's now Firestone. Some of you may remember that. The mall and the signage and the stuff just reminded me more of a Walmart from back in the day. But people came there in groves. It was new, it was fresh. Stores that they've never seen before were there. Now we have the Atlex Foot. We've got Park Lane Hosiery. Of course, Zales put a store in there. And then even our local marching band and girls would show up there and do little parades. Camelot, Penny's, Walden's, famous chocolate chip cookie store, the Foot Locker. All these big stores and chains started showing up there, and it was very convenient to park and walk and enjoy. Unfortunately, the outer stores, like this JCPenney's that was downtown next to the old Fox Theater, they finally decided it's just not profitable having two stores in Springfield, so it came to a close. Hers even opened at Battlefield Mall. They would have 3 locations in Springfield, the original store here and in Northtown. They opened at Battlefield Mall here. McCory's and then McCory's was kind of the same as like Grant's and Woolworths, and that. It was kind of like a big 5 and dime with a big lunch counter. They were there when the mall opened, and for whatever reason opted to move out, and hers moved in its place in 1976. And then they renovated and expanded in 1984. What happened for hers is they had a scenario where a local group had acquired them. There were some financial difficulties, and they got sold off to a much larger conglomerate. And by the 94, the economy was tough, and these stores were suffering, and so the group decided they just wanted out. Even though the Battlefield store was the profitable store in town and actually did really, really well, they just said, we just don't want to be in retail. So 1994-95 was the time frame that they decided it's time to end hers reign in Springfield. So, like I said, they didn't just close the one location. They opted to go ahead and close all 3. And they would have sales at all of them. But for whatever reason, it took longer to sell things than they thought. They were going to be closed up by the end of 94. And Bob Griffin, who's the manager downtown, he was happy to see all the people coming back shopping there again, but he knew why they were there, and he knew it wasn't going to last long, so he was kind of sad. But once they thinned down Battlefield and Northtown Mall, they moved what they had left to the hers on Park Central. In January 1995, the last elevator rides took place. Now, the elevator was unique because it was some of the old elevators I'm used to riding in downtown St. Louis, where you had an actual elevator operator, and then they would control how fast and what floors you stopped at, and you'd have to tell them, and they'd have to remember each floor, and then they'd have to learn how to adjust the elevator so that it would stop just right and nice and smooth. And so that came to an end in 1995. Same thing, they got down to just stuff that was in the store, telephones and merchandise and basically the stuff that they would have for decorations and chairs and whatever, and they finally cleared it out. 1996, we see Warren Davis Properties acquired the store. Ron Shepard is property manager. They had grand plans. They were going to go in there and gut the store, remodel it, and reopen it. And that was the thing that was interesting, is when I moved to town in 97, there were many people and many different plans over the years to do something with the store that, for whatever reason, just never took off. And thank goodness by 2014, the group that decided to build hers Luxury Living, they came along and they saw the advantage of having this thing remodeled. And because Francis was so concerned with fire and damage, even though the interior and the plaster work that was all on the ceilings and so forth and the columns looked hideous. I mean, the windows were gone, water had been coming in, it was in bad shape. But when they stripped it down, the building was solid. It was a great building, and definitely on the outside. And we're ever so thankful that when they reopened it in 2015, not 2105, um, they, um, um, they tried to keep as close as they could to the original exterior facade, which was not easy. But she's shiny and a grand old lady on Park Central Square again. So we're so very thankful that it's there. So the square today, this is probably the view most people think of with the History Museum and the old Nathan's and Barth building, the Landers building, now the government building, and then of course hers remodeled and open. Um, it's it's done well, and we still have a ways to go. One day we're going to find that magic little click, a mixture of businesses and different things down there, and it's just really going to explode again. And we keep trying, and I keep hoping it works out. Well, if you aren't a member of my Springfield, Missouri History and Landmarks and Vintage Photography page, do come along and join. We're well on our way to 22,000 members, and we get lots of information, and I try to do research for folks, so I get many messages per day for that very reason. So if you want anything, just hit that message button there and zing it my way, and I'll get to you just as soon as I'm humanly possibly able to do so. And, of course, if you'd like to watch some more history on Springfield, Missouri, go to my Facebook page. Look for my mug there up there in the corner and type in Richard Crabtree, and then join. If you click that little bell there, it tells you you'll get a little notice when I post a new history video, and you're welcome to view all the ones that are there. And with that, I thank you ever so much for listening to me ramble on about Springfield's history, when there will be much more to come.